G'day, it's Paul Rowe and I'm just back from a trip to Maclean on the north coast of New South Wales to the Pacific Valley and the Pacific Hope Schools. And my brief as the storyteller or writer in residence with Pacific Hills Schools is to give you what I can of my experience as a storyteller, teacher, author and broadcaster. We had a day, so my wife and I went out to see if we could join story to place in a locality and to show you how that you can do the same in your local setting. We had in mind bringing together the narratives of the Yaegl people and the Scottish settlers who came there in the 19th century, mid-19th century. And we wanted to give you a case study of that would fit with the history program for K-6, Year 5. At the close of the day, what we had was we'd met local stakeholders. We had a map, a trail, linking symbols, significant locations, and I think it would make a great template for a walking trail, for art projects, for oral histories, for photography, drama, storytelling, all sorts of things. What emerged too was not only the contrast between the two groups, between the Yaegl people and the Scots settlers, but some of the similarities. And I think there's a beginning for an ongoing dialogue between the two groups that could be creative learning and mutual respect could come out of it. We're here on a mountain looking over towards the mouth of the Clarence River near Maclean. We're going to do a little storytelling exercise. The Aboriginal people believed that they had a song line that they sang that explained their story, their connection to the creation. On this plaque here, the Yaegl people, who were the tribe who lived in this area for a long, long time, they had their creation story connected to the river here. And they said that a great serpent came in from the sea, swam up there, those sinuous curves, and barnacles fell off, and that's how the tribal people got here. Well, that's an exercise in mythology, but they were trying to connect themselves to the creation and to a creator of some kind that made this thing and put them in it. And this is a trigonometrical survey point. The Westerners, when they came, they were thinking with a scientific mind, how do you measure it? How do you sort of map it? And so Matthew Flinders sailed up the coast here early in the 1800s, and that was the first effort in mapping. And then the surveyors came along and put lines on the map, and that's how the Westerners began to see the land. How can you control this? How can you manage it? How can you make it productive? So there were two different stories, not necessarily antagonistic, but certainly competing. The Aboriginal living in the land, the Westerners saying we live on the land and we measure it and get control of it and make it productive. Two different ways of seeing it. This seat is a tribute to the mayor of this area, Joy Matthews, who loved the land, was a great environmentalist, but also wanted to bring the two stories, the Aboriginal story and reconciliation with the white people's story. And this map here of the sea and then the Clarence River flowing up there in this lovely mosaic is a symbol of somebody trying to bring the two stories together, to share our stories, accept our stories, and write a new story together. The next stop on our songline from the top of the mountain down a little bit is the Pinnacles. They're behind us. We'll have a look at those in a moment. But it's interesting, this was a sacred site for the Aboriginal people for a long time, the Yaegl people. Aboriginal elder Elizabeth Smith makes a really interesting statement. She says, including these important messages on park signs will boost awareness of our shared cultural history and lay the groundwork for a future that embraces all Australians and promotes mutual respect and shared responsibility for our land. How good's that? Saying we've got to bring our two stories together, and this Pinnacle site doesn't just belong to the Aboriginal people, but it's a symbol maybe that there's a new story being written. It's interesting to contrast the Aboriginal way of seeing the Pinnacles and the Western way. They look at it and they've got it here, explanation saying, well, what kind of rock it is, how it was formed, how the, the forces that made it. This is the Pinnacles. In the background you can see the Clarence River, and it's just near the town of Maclean. It's a great symbol. It's a beautiful thing, isn't it? Amazing, precarious looking rock there. The Aboriginal people saw it as a symbol. They made a story to go with it. It was part of their walking trail and their sacred site, probably for the women, they think. So they saw it as part of an integral part of their journey in their own land. The Westerners probably just saw it as a phenomenon. Wow, look at that, that's amazing. And they tried to find a scientific explanation of how it all got there. It got weathered and so on. Two different ways of seeing the story. It wasn't that the Westerners didn't have a spiritual story, but they sort of drove two stories side by side, the scientific and the spiritual. So the Pinnacles at Maclean. We're just downhill from the Pinnacles, and this cairn was built to memorialise the Scottish settlers who came here in the mid-1800s. One of the things really interesting is that these Scottish clans came from the Highlands of Scotland. In the early 1800s they were being driven off their land, told to stop speaking Gaelic, stop wearing kilts, and were forced into Glasgow, came here as immigrants and settled in this part of the area, but they were refugees looking for a home, looking for a place to settle their families. I like this symbol because they brought stones from all over Australia and Scotland to symbolise the coming of these different groups here to Australia. The Maclean clan, for example, has its little motto here, virtue, mine honour. So they did bring a very spiritual element with them in their clans, and this cairn speaks of a group of people who came here looking for a home and bringing with them a spiritual heritage of their own. Maclean declares itself the Scottish town of Australia. All around town there are these poles painted with various clan tartans. This is my family's clan, the Bairds, my mother's clan. If you've got a Scottish heritage and you came here, you could probably find your telegraph pole. But they're all symbols of a heritage that goes back a long way. As you can hear, I'm on the edge of Maclean, and this is the oldest public building in Maclean, and that tells you something about this town. It was the first building built here, and it tells you that the Scots made first and foremost their spiritual life, and they preached here for a long time in English and in Gaelic, and sang the Psalms without music accompaniment, which takes them back a long way to another story, to the story of Israel. They sang the Psalms of Israel from the Bible. Another pilgrim people, another displaced people who gave the world a great story, and here the Scots brought it to this region, and it's become part of the life of this region, the story of the Bible, and it had a profound effect on the shaping of this community. I'm in the shade of this beautiful Royal Poinciana tree, and near the Presbyterian Church. You know, the interesting thing I discovered was that those Scottish settlers that came here were brought here by a man called the Reverend John Dunmore Lang, and he was a very big mover and shaker in the early part of the colony's history here in New South Wales, and he was particularly interested in bringing immigrants from Scotland mainly to become sort of reliable, good workers, people of calibre and Christian character. So he went 4 or 5 times to Scotland and brought shiploads of them back here. One group came here to Maclean. So it's an interesting thing, isn't it? There was a Christian initiative, a man who put himself out there to bring these settlers here with a purpose. I'm standing under the Harwood Bridge on the Maclean-Yamba Road, and these 4 mural pillars you see behind me are the 4 guardians of the river. It was a mural painted in cooperation with the Road Commission, plus the local council, plus the Aboriginal people of the area, to talk about the story of the river flooding in 2022, a shared story. But they used these symbols here on the river, 4 guardians of the river. I like it. There's a sort of a way of saying the modern apparatus, this huge span across the river, the shared experience of the flood, the two cultures coming together to make a statement together, to write a new story, to accept the story and write a new story together. I like this space here because the Historical Museum is actually on the site of what was the Aboriginal camp here, where the Aboriginal people were sort of pushed out of their traditional ways, and they lived here in tin sheds in the 1920s and so on. And life was hard. They were on the fringe and they were having that struggle between the two cultures. But I like this effort to try and bring the two stories together, to say, well, our shared history, we've got to listen to the Aboriginal story and the hardships they had and the way they were mistreated often. And then for the rest of the story to be told as to why the settlers came here. They too were dispossessed. And so that idea of, listening to one another's stories, this is a great place. It's well done. I like this space here. It's a yarning circle. The stones are here, and the traditional Aboriginal idea of storytelling is that's where they learned their own story and their own storyline. But I like the way they've structured this. They put it at the entrance to the Presbyterian Kirk that was here from the early 1920s. It was a very integral part of this Scottish-based community, and a place for community and meeting and sharing stories and singing psalms. These two cultures, symbol of the two cultures in dialogue, which is what we've been talking about, sharing our stories, accepting our stories, listening to one another, and then developing a new storyline together that takes into account God's big story, I think. And I like this, it's very symbolic. I'm here in the main street leading into Maclean, and on the wall here you can see the image of Uncle Ron Heron, who is a respected elder of the Yagal people, the late Ron Heron. Remarkable stories. Born in a mission school and went to a mission school up around Lismore. Came down here as a cane cutter in the 50s. And then decided, I'm going to get educated. So he went to Canberra, got himself a degree in anthropology and archaeology, and came back up here and began to teach up at Lismore University and in the local community. And he was a well-respected man, a kind man, loved being amongst children. Macquarie University sent students up to him, and eventually he was given an honorary doctorate. So it's quite a remarkable story, a man who, born on a mission, had all those experiences that the Aboriginal people had, still owned his Aboriginal background, his Yagal people, but stepped into the world of university and education and brought the two together and became a respected scholar in his own right. And I think it's a nice picture to finish on, I suppose, of the two stories coming together, the Yagal people's traditional stories and the scientific world, if you like. And it meets there in this man, his personality, and he was a giver to this community. He was buried last year up in the Anglican church here, and you can see by the way the artist has done this, he's put a smile on his face. The sad part of the story was that somebody graffitied over this very soon after it was painted, but the community got behind the artist. He came back and restored it, and put a smile on his face to say, I'm back. So, Uncle Ron Heron, respect. Many of you know I've written a book called Tell Me Another. It's about story and storytelling. And there's a chapter in there on pilgrimage, and I wanted to read you a little piece that I think fits with the little project we've just done. It's the story of a man called Bruce Philo, who was a secular Jew, went looking for the story of the Bible because he didn't know it. He walked it from all around the way around to Canaan with an archaeologist. And he said something happened to him. He said his learning went from his head to his feet. So the big transformation was being on the land, he said, and finding the story in the geography itself. I don't think I ever realised that the Bible consisted of real stories that happened to real people. I think I always thought of it as happening in some kind of mythic place and time. So I think what happened to me was that I just became really grounded. Well, that idea of joining story to plays, walking the territory, I think for the children and the teachers could bring the stories of your local area, the history of the local area together and bring it to life with the people that you meet along the way. The Aboriginal people were doing this all the time. They sang their songline as they walked their territory, and it told them who they were, where they'd come from, where they were going. There's a guy called Bruce Chatwin, a travel writer, who said what he noticed with the Aboriginal people about their songlines. They said if you didn't know your songline, you just simply didn't exist. And he said that the temporal melody and the spiritual melody interpolated each other, combined to form the tribe's songline, a daily narrative that made no sense if it was separated from their Dreamtime narrative. The dislocation from the material world was, in a very real sense, a cultural death sentence. So in other words, you know, our local stories are not just disconnected, they're not just something in history, but they have a spiritual underpinning. The Scottish story has a spiritual underpinning. The Scottish settlers brought the Christian faith with them, their Presbyterian faith. The Aboriginal people had walked their territory and they had very clear understanding, or at least they were groping towards an understanding of the Creator. So I think there's a place there where those two stories can be brought together. And I hope the little example we've given you can help you to see how that might happen where you live, in your space, in your place, and have the fun of creating something like we did. It took us a day, not very technical, but I think you can see that it's got great potential.